But if, by Sufi definition, and surely we must listen to it, the real development of Sufism and its applications is not to be found in academic work or in random or uninstructed experimentation, and if Sufism is to be absorbed by such a judicious process as might be comparable to the working with a master of an art rather than a profession, what of the other widespread and, to some, quite attractive alternative? After all, there are in the West, and always have been in the East, large and small groups of people, and plenty of vociferous individuals as well, who maintain that Sufism, being grounded in experience, and not being available through static scholasticism or automatistic piety, should and must be cultivated by means of overrunning the emotions, by listening to or playing music, by dancing and wearing strange clothes, by changing one's name, and by slavishly following what the participants imagine to be the literal instructions of some preferably ancient and revered but long dead teacher. Such people, in the nature of things, have far greater social visibility than the often much more inhibited scholars. They and their works are to be found in a larger and much more animated constituency. Because of this, many ordinary people lump them together with all the other cultists, members of esotericist groupings with dauntingly formidable names and even greater pretensions. They call them nuts and politely avoid them. I, for one, would not blame anyone for concluding that they are dealing with just another yogic, Hindu, Zen, or similar group. Perhaps, though, they are not strictly similar. But it is equally true to say that such coteries are not Sufi ones in the sense that Sufi is employed by the traditional teachers or by contemporary Sufis who maintain a wider tradition and more comprehensive approach. Their activities, indeed, whether emphasizing the playing or hearing of music, or dance, or singing, or recitations, or wearing non-current dress or assuming locally peculiar names, these are all familiar to us in the East, and are clearly distinguished in the historical perspective of the Sufi classics as, frankly, deviant forms stabilized on quite obvious social needs. But that which human sciences people politely call needs, we often describe more pungently. My purpose in mentioning them is to ask you not to throw the baby away with the bathwater, not to shun Sufism because of them, and not to imagine that there was any useful purpose beyond entertainment to be served by taking notice of them. Remember, they have been with us for centuries, and people in most Eastern countries where they are to be found have basic, descriptive names for them, and not always very complimentary ones at that. Both the overly academic and the cultic forms of so-called Sufism then might by some, perhaps admissible stretch of the language be called studies of Sufism, but they cannot ever be called studies in Sufism. So there are the usual reactions seen from one perspective. But what is the brief theory of Sufism? Who are the past and present authorities? What are the standard books? How is it organized? What does it promise? How long will it take? What do I pay, and how soon can I join? These are the main questions which I have collected from some tens of thousands of letters from people who, of course, know next to nothing of the subject. I have over 140,000 letters on file, and have in the past discussed this matter with some 20,000 people, though I avoid it as much as possible. Still, about 20 a week is the average of conversations. The questions may show, I think you will agree, things other than a straightforward search for information and truth. They indicate, for instance, that the questioners are trained in approaching a subject in a certain manner, and that does not include asking, "What can you tell me about this subject?" including whether it falls into my categories or not. They seldom, if ever, say, "What do I need to know, or how do I have to be, to approach this subject?" Our experience shows that people who approach matters in the realistic but mechanical manner are not likely to be interested in Sufism at all. The way they approach things shows what they are expecting to meet. They are the servants of a mental model, seeking not knowledge but the fulfillment of expectations. I say are not likely to be interested in Sufism because the degree of inflexibility which accompanies the so-called systematic approach will vary. I will now ask you to monitor your own reactions when I answer the questions we quoted a moment ago in a manner designed to further Sufi knowledge, not as a mechanical scholar. There is no brief theory of Sufism. Virtually every single one of the past and present authorities has been challenged by non-Sufis as not being a Sufi at all, or not being a classical Sufi, or with some other such reproach. There are no truly standard books in the conventional sense, because Sufi books are designed, like Sufi practices, to fit in with local and temporal circumstances, which is why they differ and vary so much. The object of Sufism is to be a nutrient, not to provide entertainment. It does not promise anything. It has no study timescale as in intellectual exercise or social groups. It has and has not got systems of praying, and understands this in various ways, and strictly speaking, one does not join to become a Sufi. There is not even a name of universal application for the student or the activity. The Sufi is the product of Sufism, which is itself a Western word invented in 1821 by the German scholar Friedrich August Tholuck of Berlin. And yet all Sufis can recognize one another, though imitators have to rely on signs and signals. This former sensitivity, however, happens through perception of the inner quality, and never depends on outward criteria. If you read a fair cross-section of the books on Sufis and Sufism on the market today, and it is a good market, you will find that various mystical masters and scholars, whom I call the gurus and academics, adduce evidence from books to show that Sufis are only Muslims, but also that they are opposed to Islam, that they are Shias of Islam, or that they are only Sunnis, these being the two main schools of law among the Muslims, that they originated in Persia, in Greece or India, that they use music or condemn it, and so on. All these contentions, of course, and numerous others, reflect only the superficialities which result from looking at some of the evidence, or else from trying to amalgamate it all, without realizing that Sufis regard things of the world, of the social and psychological domain, as instruments, and will use almost anything which connects appropriately with the attainment of their goal. So we are still at the condition, in externalist studies of Sufism, equivalent to that of the blind men and the elephant, when each blind man seized a part of the elephant and insisted that it was a fan, the ear, a rope, the tail, a pillar, a leg, and so on. This situation is only to be expected given the circumstances and biases of the people who are working with the residual materials. The same thing, the blind men and the elephant syndrome, would happen if a number of people with various backgrounds and biases were to be let loose on a newly discovered civilization whose bases were unknown to them. Each would try to relate it to a personal or culture-based mental model. In most current forms of investigative culture, too, each would regard the materials found as basic and essential. They would tend not to believe that there might be an inward unity, a deeper level at which the design could be understood. This situation is not confined to the West or to our time, although it is very marked with us at the moment, so much so that for many people it is the sole reality, rather like life seen on a TV screen might be for someone born and brought up in a sitting room of the suburbs, and never leaving it. I would like to make it clear at this point, however, that this attitude is by no means unanimous, and that we have little real difficulty in conveying our way of thinking and our priorities of attitude to a sufficiently large number, though not perhaps a major proportion, of people. The interesting thing to note here seems to me to be that these people are found only in relatively small numbers in the old-fashioned parts of the academic and cultic communities. They are more numerous almost everywhere else. This observation appears to indicate that the activity of the search for truth, as expressed through scholarly or theology-centered approaches, is in itself a form of employment, a stabilization which in itself yields satisfactions which prevent any more versatile interest being expressed. By this I mean that these are not so much paths to knowledge as small or large tribes or communities which have an unwitting vested interest in maintaining their methods of thought and action, because these give them outlets or satisfactions. The search for truth is, therefore, in such cases, subordinate to the stimuli which come from remaining in a system called the scientific method, or exercising the sovereign human intellect, or the true spirituality which comes through constant ritualistic practice. And who would blame them? I do not feel it necessary to criticize this approach in an unqualified way, though I do think it important, for the sake of other types of people, that an alternative formulation be represented and maintained. I have therefore concentrated, for the most part, on publishing books which further this objective. I am sure that it is the use of one's métier as a personal psychological stabilizer that causes so many observers to try to pluck out just one or two aspects of Sufism to study or try to employ. Such people use what they call Sufism as an occupational therapy, not to yield its true content. This is not to say that Sufism is claimed to be sui generis, of a unique kind. Such a contention is needed only if we are trying to assert its indispensability or preeminence in some sense. Sufism is, however, something which Sufis themselves always claim is studied by means of itself, by its own tools, and is not susceptible to outward analysis. We have seen, and you can check this in 100 ways from published literature of all kinds, what happens when people attempt to get to the bottom of Sufism through its outward forms. People become fascinated by the ESP characteristics sometimes observed in Sufis. But the first requirement in a Sufi student is that he conceal this development from outside inquisitiveness. ESP is a byproduct of the process of transcending boundaries. Sufi literature, exercises, contentions, and so on are not ever to be regarded primarily as informational or illustrative. They are instructional, and that is that. Some Sufi materials may have cultural attractiveness, some may contain information, but these are not their chief purposes. When, therefore, we speak of the development and applications of Sufism, these other categories are to be understood to be spin-offs, even at their highest ordinarily visible function. This does not mean that a Sufi who saves someone's life or is active or successful in the quantifiable sense would rather not do it, or that Sufis want to keep materials secret and deplore the imitators' caperings when they mime Sufi specializations. It means that however much the products of Sufi development are valued by non-Sufis and are contributing to the advance of ordinary knowledge and the tranquility, progress, and success of society, this is a secondary phenomenon to the Sufi. If, by enlarged knowledge, a Sufi does something which other people applaud or think heroic, say he cannot think of himself as distinguished or a hero, since he has almost by definition a panoramic view of life which has told him both what might happen under certain circumstances and how little ultimate importance this holds, or how much. Things which are not understood by those who therefore judge in a local and parochial way. He may even be blamed for not sharing knowledge or for arbitrary action when he and his congeners know that the Sufi role is not capable of exposition. So the Sufi cannot supply systems and ideas which are designed to be used by a society to improve itself, and for this to be presented as an objective of Sufism. The objective of Sufism is to become a Sufi, and this development in turn has an effect, sometimes a determining effect, on individual and group psychology and on society. It is not the other way about. For this reason, there are severe limits to the extent to which a Sufi can cooperate in the supply and in applying things for, as it were, secondary use. The Sufi, in the world but not of it, will fulfill whatever temporal functions he can, but his task is not in harmonizing with society at all other costs. The fact that Sufis have been able to contribute so much, and continue to do so, to world culture in so many aspects is not because of just deciding to love man, but because their Sufic experience shows them that human service is necessary. But they have their own perspective on how and when and where it may be most effectively carried out. They are not idealists, who almost by definition have a restricted view and only hope. It is idealists alone who qualify for the title of hero. This statement was being made by one prominent Sufi once when an interrupter called out, "Then why is the world in such a mess?" Before he could answer, another voice shouted, "If it was not for them, we would all have been destroyed." I find this, among other things, an interesting example of the only two ways of thinking, either or, illustrated by the two main types. The first we may call the intellectual, the other the emotional. Sufi understanding, according to the practitioners, transcends these two modes, valuable though they are for so many purposes. Without them, of course, we would have to cease to be Sufis and attend to the more basic intellectual and emotional modes on which society is at present stabilized. But that is an area of hypothetical discussion.